The rain fell the night they took her in. 7 years old, soaked through, standing on a doorstep with a small bag and no parents left to come back for her, that was the first image, and it never really left her. Her aunt opened the door with a face that said the word burden before her mouth ever did. The house was not cruel in the way stories make cruelty easy to see. There were no locked cupboards, no raised hands. It was quieter than that, a cruelty of small portions. The smallest room, the coldest corner of the table, the school shoes handed down a size too big. Her cousins had birthdays with cake. She had birthdays that no one mentioned out loud. She learned early that no one was coming to rescue her, so she stopped waiting for it. At 10, she was already the one who woke before dawn to have the kitchen swept before her aunt came down, not because she was asked to, but because it was one version of the house where she was allowed to feel useful instead of unwanted. At 12, she found an old, cracked laptop a neighbor was throwing out and taught herself, in stolen hours after everyone slept, how to make it work again. At 14, she was fixing other people's phones and computers for a little money her aunt didn't know about, hidden in a torn lining of her school bag. Her aunt found it once. Counted it in front of her. Called her ungrateful for keeping secrets in a house that fed her. She said nothing. She only put the money back where she'd hidden it once her aunt left the room, and kept going. By 16, she had built her first small website for a shop in the neighborhood, for almost nothing, just to prove to herself she could. By 18, she left the house the day she turned 18, with the same small bag she had arrived with 11 years earlier, now carrying a laptop instead of nothing. The years that followed were not softened for the camera. There were apartments with barely any furniture. Nights coding until the light came up, living on very little, failing twice before anything worked. There was a small company that almost died in its first year, saved only because she refused, on some deep and quiet level, to let it. There was a moment, the story always needs this moment, where everything she had built nearly collapsed, and she sat alone in an empty office at 3 a.m. and asked herself if she was simply repeating the same abandonment she grew up in, except this time by her own hand. She did not let it collapse. The company grew. Then it grew again, faster than anyone, including her, expected. What had started as a woman with a second-hand laptop became, within a decade, something spoken about in rooms she had once only read about, headlines, valuations, a name that no longer needed explaining. She became, by every measure the world uses to measure such things, a billionaire. But this was never really a story about money. It was a story about a doorstep in the rain, and a house where she had learned to make herself small enough not to be a problem. Money was only the proof, the visible part of something she had built in the dark for a long time before anyone else could see it. She did not go back for revenge. That was important to her, though she could never fully explain why, even to herself. She went back because there was a version of this story that only ended properly in that same house. She arrived on a rainy evening again. She hadn't planned that, but she noticed it, the way the sky seemed to insist on closing the same door it had opened. Her aunt was older now, smaller than memory had made her, living alone in the same house with the same narrow hallway that had once felt so large to a child standing in it. Her aunt opened the door and, for a long moment, didn't recognize her. Then she did, and something crossed her face that wasn't quite shame and wasn't quite pride, something in between, something that didn't have a clean name. She didn't come with anger. She didn't come with a speech. She simply stood in that doorway, older now, dressed simply, carrying nothing that announced what she had become, and she let her aunt look at her, really look, for the first time in either of their lives. "I didn't come back to ask you for anything," she said quietly. "I came back to show you I didn't need to be saved by anyone. I saved myself." Her aunt's eyes filled, not with an apology exactly, some people are never quite able to give one cleanly, but with something that finally resembled seeing her. Truly seeing her, not as a burden that had arrived on a rainy night 11 years old with a bag too small, but as a person who had built, alone, out of almost nothing, a life large enough to walk back into that same small hallway and no longer feel small in it. She didn't stay long. She hadn't come to rebuild what had never really been built in the first place. She had come to close a door properly, the way it should have been closed a long time ago. As she walked back out into the rain, she looked back once at the house, smaller now than it had ever felt as a child, and somehow, at the same time, exactly as large as it needed to be to make sense of everything that came after it. She had survived it. Then she had outgrown it. And now, finally, she had walked back through it on her own terms, not to be given anything, and not to take anything either, but simply to stand, once, fully herself, in the one place that had once told her she wasn't enough. She was enough. She always had been. Subscribe the channel and hit the like button, comment your thoughts, also hit the bell button to get new stories. Thank you for watching.